My name is Carole Piovesan. I am with INQ Data Law. We are a brand new law firm. We're about 8 weeks old. If you try to find us online, despite the fact that I'm going to be speaking to you about AI and law, we actually don't have a website. So that's coming. So today I want to talk to you about this intersection that I've been talking about for nearly 3 years now. And I really want to applaud the Law Commission of Ontario for bringing this program to you, because this is a very good time to be talking about AI and law. And Toronto and Canada and Montreal, our friends from Montreal, these are great places from which to be talking about artificial intelligence because of the strength of our research community, the vibrancy of our startup ecosystem, and a lot of the development that's been happening at the government and policy level. So AI is going to shape all of what we do. That's not an understatement. And we're going to talk a little bit about why I say this. In fact, I didn't say it, but the CEO of Microsoft did. But we're going to talk a little bit about why he says this and why this is a topic that you keep hearing about in the news day in and day out. And we're going to talk about this from the perspective of law. As a lawyer, I'm always curious to know how on earth am I going to practice in this area. So we're going to talk about it from the perspective of law. We're going to talk about ethics, and we're going to talk a touch about explainability. But I think Richard did such a great job that I'm going to cut it off there. So let's look at AI in society. Let's just start by contextualizing AI in society and why it's so important, what it's going to touch. And again, I think Richard did a very good job in laying out the structure and laying out the sort of the playing field of what's happening in the development of artificial intelligence. But fundamentally, you're talking about data. It is no longer the widget that is going to make you billions of dollars. It's pieces of information about you and me that is going to make a company billions and billions of dollars, and how you analyze and process that data for the purposes of efficiencies and the purposes of predictive insights. So it is taking those pieces of data that we are giving up every day, and we're going to look at this in a minute. It's giving up those pieces of data, analyzing those pieces of data, and turning them into a predictive insight that makes prediction cheaper, more accurate, and faster. It is power. It touches on all aspects of our society. It touches on our privacy, and it's really raising some really fundamental and interesting debates about what is privacy and what do we care about? What are we willing to give up and why in exchange for what? What does the barter system look like when it comes to privacy? Is a free search engine good enough if you get to take all of my data? It touches on questions of ethics. It's not just a question of what can I create, but what should I create? And we're going to look at examples of facial recognition in a little bit. Inclusion. Richard showed, I think, a very good diagram of how you can divide according to ethnic groups. If you're not represented in the data set, if you're not represented as a programmer, if you're not part of making the assumptions, then are you going to be excluded as a group? So questions of inclusion, accountability, and justice. The predictive policing example was a great example of how we have a lot of concerns around accountability and the use of sophisticated systems based on historical data. The public good. There are some who predict that artificial intelligence could actually help us reverse climate change. It could actually help us cure a huge number of diseases or conditions if we were to mobilize the data sets and use the predictive power of artificial intelligence for those purposes. But it's a yin and yang. Yes, there's a lot of great that can come from it, but there are also huge challenges associated with it if in the wrong hands. Economics. There are predictions that say, again, these are predictions, but they say, artificial intelligence will be responsible for an infusion of something like $15.5 trillion into the global economy by 2030. So this is not just a game of knowledge. It's a game about economics. It's a game about financial gains. Labor market, speaking about the future of work in particular, are we situating ourselves such that augmentation won't be enough? That in fact there will be huge swaths of the labor market that are replaced? And I think that's an open debate. right? There are lots who say, yes, you might replace a number of workers, but that, those jobs may be replaced, but there are other jobs that will be created. So be creative, keep your mind open, think about your transition strategy. So here's the deal. Artificial intelligence is a general use technology. You can see it in every sector, in every vertical. When people ask me, well, where is it having an effect? I don't know, where is society happening? It is or can have an effect in every sector of society. It is a general use technology. Currently, it is arguably unaccountable under the law, meaning we don't have regulation that is specific to artificial intelligence. But again, I'm going to park that with a caveat, because this is changing, and it's changing much faster than I even anticipated. It is changing because of concerns with, and as Richard put it, the no-go zones. Are there certain things, it was Richard or Phil who said, there are certain use cases that we're not going to allow. They will be no-go zones when it comes to artificial intelligence. But let's go back to this question of sort of geopolitical power and power. Who is it a no-go zone for? And what happens when it's not a no-go zone for somebody else? And I'll leave that as a question. It's a question that is becoming increasingly fascinating to me as we look at technologies like facial recognition and who's developing it and who's not developing it and how that might play out geopolitically. I'm also a poli-sci background, so I can't help but get pretty excited about these things. There's a new generation of law that's going to be required because of artificial intelligence, and we're going to look at this in a minute. And finally, we still need to think about some of those principles. We are still grappling with ethical principles and legal principles as it relates to this really fascinating and evolutionary technology. So why today? Well, there's a huge amount of data. There's a huge amount of data being created every single day as we walk around with our devices, not one, but I've got two. So I am perfectly well tracked. And people know exactly where I am. There's a huge amount of data. The computing power is cheaper, faster, storage is cheaper, we have more talent in this area, and increasingly we have more investments in this area and more government and company or enterprise attention to the development of artificial intelligence. So before I go into some of the three main topics that I want to discuss, I did want to touch on a case study just to make it concrete. And I chose a case study from financial services, though having seen how much was done in the FS sector in the prior presentations, I sort of wish I had chosen a different one, but let's just run through this. So this is a case study out of the Bank of New York Mellon Corp. Around 2016, they decided that they were going to create 220 bots. These bots were focused on handling tasks that were very rote, routine, repetitive. For example, data requests from external auditors, fund transfer bots, and bots that are correcting formatting and data mistakes. And if you don't know what a bot is, it is a system with which you can interact that can make sense of your language, whether oral or written, and give meaningful language back. Or take actions based on the command. So they roll out this project of 220 bots. And what they find is actually pretty impressive, right? They have 100% accuracy in account closure validations across 5 systems. 100% accuracy. They have 88% improvement in processing time, 66% improvement in trade and entry turnaround, and something else that I find remarkable. So 1/4 of a second in robotic reconciliation versus 5 to 10 minutes. So from an enterprise perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And you can see why there will be, as one example, why there would be a lot of interest at the enterprise level for your clients who are going to be thinking more strategically about where their companies are going. And it's not just in the bots, right? Like there are numerous use cases in financial services where artificial intelligence is being used. And this last one of robotic process automation, I put sort of as a caveat. I wouldn't really generally call that AI, but I've got it there. In reference to sort of the internal, you've got to think of it in 2 ways. Internal efficiency. So what is rote and routine where I can effectively smart automate it at a higher level? And you've got examples when it comes to, for instance, risk management, or in taking the bot example again in personalized banking. I don't know how many of you love getting on the phone with your bank. I personally wish there was a smart bot on the other side that I could, at 3 in the morning when I'm very irritated by my account, I can quickly send an email, get an immediate response, and whatever I had asked to be done is done. Doesn't necessarily happen quite yet. But then there's also the predictive value of AI, the fact that it can analyze massive amounts of data and it can spot trends that we can't see. And it will do so in an unconventional way. So we don't really understand how it got there because the method is not one that we would apply. And so from a trading perspective, again mentioned earlier, the value is tremendous because in record real time, you are analyzing massive amounts of data and making decisions that affect a price. And this might explain why there are huge investments in this area. We're not talking millions of dollars. Some of the largest banks in the US are investing billions of dollars in their tech infrastructure. The investment in these areas will differentiate those who have innovated and who will sort of survive into the next 10 years and those who won't. So my roadmap. I promised you I was going to talk to you about sort of the ethical AI from the perspective of law, bias, and then touch on explainability. So here's the roadmap ahead. And really the reason I chose these 3 in particular was because I think it's important to talk about and think about how the legal landscape is going to change and why. Talk about other sort of, I would call them almost softer legal issues such as ethics and bias, and be really aware of how these 2 corollary topics, or I don't want to call them corollary, maybe integrated topics, have a role in law, and then explainability and some of the real questions we see coming up in the legal context. So on the horizon, what do we see? We see that artificial intelligence is, as a product or because of its creation, meaning the amount of data that's required in order to create and train AI systems, it really is creating a change in the legal regulatory regime in Canada and around the world. So I have categorized 3 changes, but I admit to you up front that the second sort of intermediate or medium-term change is happening much faster than I think I give it credit for. But we're going to talk first about the immediate change. So what's happening right now? And I think Phil did a very good job in telling you about some of the regulation that we see changing. We talked about GDPR, the policy initiatives. We see multilateral engagement on AI standards, and this is important. Medium term, we see an identification of foreseeable harm. So what do we really think is going to happen, and where do we think it can be problematic? And then longer term, we see more on the theoretical side still, but we're going to talk about why it's not purely theoretical. Real questions about whether these systems are going to shake some of those foundational principles of law. Will law have to change because these systems exist? Or can we argue by analogy to existing legal paradigms? So regulating data. The pace of data accumulation is staggering. We see that there are 3.7 billion people on the internet now. Just looking at the Facebook users alone, it says 2 billion active Facebook users. So that does not include those who joined Facebook and then decommissioned but still have all their data on Facebook. Google processes over 40,000 searches every second. And let me just, I've found this nice little picture. And what it does is it sort of highlights for me how much is happening every minute, how much data we are giving up every minute. If you look at just the text messages, okay, so you say 18 million in 2018, 18.1 million in 2019 as an estimate, but that's every minute that this is happening. So the amount of data that is being transferred and the fluidity with which it's being transferred is really astounding. And data, as I said, is power. The geopolitics of data is really interesting. And it's becoming more and more interesting as we see countries like China really push ahead, where their privacy legislation is significantly different than ours. And GDPR and our European colleagues or friends or allies struggling to create a regime using its large geographic and population base to fight back. With the US, that also has a very different regulatory regime in the privacy space, also, at the forefront of innovation in every sense, but trying to determine how do we rectify the true potential of innovation with our democratic values, of which privacy is fundamental. And I don't want to spend too much time on the GDPR because I think Phil did a good job to describe it. The next is really looking at what are the foreseeable harms. So just yesterday, so I had this slide, I created this slide about, 5 weeks ago for a presentation. And when I looked at it again, I thought, oh my gosh, it's already out of date. It's already out of date. It's not medium term. This is actually happening much faster than I anticipated. So the last time I had this slide, there was a projection. Microsoft has said that we should regulate facial recognition. Today, when I have this slide, I can tell you that yesterday, San Francisco did ban the use of facial recognition in law enforcement. In local authorities, including law enforcement. So the pace at which change is happening, even regulatory change, which we typically pride ourselves on as being glacial, it's happening much faster than we could ever expect. Our own government, within 6 months, created a directive on automated decision-making that helps government departments determine a risk level for a particular automated decision, so an AI system that's going to be making decisions, identifying what are particular risks for which we require a human in the loop. They did this, again, within record speed. I think it was our CIO or Chief Information Officer who said it took about 6 months to do in an open context, on a consultative basis. And this is influential not only for government, our government, but for governments. Other governments are looking to what Canada has done, and companies trying to understand how do we create more robust and transparent decision-making frameworks? How do we build our own due diligence defense when it comes to the use of automated decisions in more sensitive contexts? We see that the FTC recently, out of the US, the Trade Commission, said something that I thought was really interesting, that as part of their privacy enforcement, they are thinking about personal liability for executives. And this is in the US, where they don't have robust privacy protection for private sector. They don't have that. And here you've got the FTC saying, you know what, we're going to be a little bit more directed about this. And then Dr. Hinton, our own AI, father of deep learning, who said we might need a Geneva-like convention for the use of AI in warfare. Well, last report is that the Pentagon's putting in something like $75 billion into understanding artificial intelligence in the military. So maybe he's right. When we think about reevaluating foundational principles of law, why do I say this? So I offer you my very inelegant definition of AI. That's how I refer to it every time. Because it's very much from my own perspective, to think through what are the legal issues that I need to be mindful of when I think about the uniqueness of this technology. And so I say it's a computer system that analyzes massive amounts of data, learns from the analysis, and takes action in unconventional ways with remote human involvement. And I say this because I am reminded, as a computer system, it is inorganic. It is not you and me. It's not a dog. It is an inorganic system. It is evolutionary. It's not static. And you heard Richard say this as well. This is an evolutionary moving system that is constantly learning based on the data it's receiving. It is action-oriented. It is not, again, not static in the sense of processing words. It's actually able to interact. It's able to be influenced. It's able to take a step. If you are a self-driving car, it is able to turn right or stop at a red light. So it can be action-oriented. It does things in unconventional ways. We don't understand how the system analyzes the information. We don't understand why it favors certain things over certain outcomes or outputs over others. But we understand what the intended output is. We understood what we have optimized it for. We just don't understand why it did what it did. And it has remote human involvement. So again, this is the more sophisticated system. This is not the everyday system that you're using, but over time, the human involvement becomes more and more remote, which raises some pretty interesting questions around liability. You know, to the extent that there is a creator and there is a harm caused down the line, and the creator of the system or the trainer of the system has very, very little to do with the system over a period of time, and this system is evolving over a period of time, then to what extent can you really extend liability to the individual creator or trainer? And there's a great example about this. In the news, again, just 2 weeks ago, there's a Hong Kong tycoon who is suing because the AI system that is determining his stocks, his trading, really messed up as far as he's concerned. Lost $20 million in a day. But he can't sue the system, so he's going after the broker. And I have no idea what's going to happen. I read the case. I mean, it was a news report, so you don't get too much detail. I read it as a misrepresentation case. I think that's why he's going after the broker. But you could see how this can evolve and how it can become increasingly complex. And it really does touch every area of law. But again, I don't want to go into this in too much detail because I think Phil did a very good job in outlining some of the different legal issues that AI touches upon and will have an influence on, including competition and human rights. So let's now move to the question of sort of ethics and bias. So we talk a lot about that, and Nai's question about predictive policing is a good one. What are we worried about? What are the sources of bias that you find in these AI systems, and where are we worried? So there are different sources of bias, and I wouldn't say this is the most exhaustive list, but these are examples of where you will find bias. So selection bias. Your data set underrepresents a particular group. Amazon recently had this problem in their HR practices. They were looking to use AI to help them spot some really great candidates to bring in. Turns out the system, which I don't think was ever rolled out publicly, they were constantly testing it and training it, favored white men. Why? Because their data set had predominantly, and I'm going to make an assumption here because I actually don't know this to be true, but I understand that their data set was skewed towards white men. And it's not because they were favoring white men in particular. It's just that that's who was their population. And they were using their population, their high performers, to help indicate and help project who their future high performers could be. Well, you got to optimize for an incomplete data set. Or interaction bias. So interaction bias is the great example of Microsoft's chatbot Tay, who within 24 hours of being released into the public turned into an awful, awful chatbot. Very misogynistic and Holocaust denying and very racist. And the question was, well, why did this happen? How did this go so wrong? And part of the answer is, well, because the people interacting with Tay either had a great laugh at Tay's expense and decided to test how awful the chatbot can be, or we're actually saying terrible things to the chatbot sincerely. And in return, the chatbot learned through the interaction with humans, trying to understand, is this normal behavior? Is this appropriate? Is this okay? No, it's not okay. Emergent bias. So this is something we are talking a lot about in the debate about democracy. Is the news feed, that is, because I liked this one article, now you assume I only want articles of that nature, and so you're only feeding me articles of that nature, is that causing a certain other form of bias, which is more on the receiving end? You're only giving me information that you think I want to see. It creates a bias bubble. And then latent bias. So again, this is some of the assumptions that are being made throughout the development and training process. And are you being mindful of these variables that can cause harm? The correlation as an example of the label doctor with a white male or nurse with a white female. And where do we see opportunities of bias or for bias? So here you've got some examples. Does the data reflect inherent bias? So again, let's go back to the data set. Put my own timer on. Does the data reflect inherent bias? Have we made the right assumptions? Have we turned our minds to the issues that we think are going to be problematic, and have we addressed them before we release this bot or this system publicly? Have we chosen appropriate use cases? There are great examples of things we can build, but just because we can build them, the question is, should we? Or should we choose not to build them for other ethical reasons, because it could cause harm in other ways? Or if we do choose to build them, knowing that they could cause ethical harm, what guardrails do we put around to protect the public from harm? And then finally, what are the possible harms? Have we thought through that? And when I look at this diagram, I always think, how do I build this out? How could I build this out in a due diligence defense? So there is no regulation that can tell me what I can and can't do necessarily, or there are multiple different forms of regulation that might give me different pieces of what I can and can't do. So how do I, as a company, or I as a lawyer, how do I build out my own framework, my own governance framework, to Richard's point, for a good due diligence defense? And then I promised you I was going to touch a little bit on accountability and explainability. I agree with Richard that it is not every use case that requires an explainable AI. And so the risk, you really need to be thinking about what is the risk management framework around the deployment of a particular system or creation of a particular system. But to get to the last two bullets, it is about thinking of accountability. It is, you may not be able to explain exactly what layer of the neural net processed which piece of information to ultimately result in whatever the output is. And frankly, nobody cares about that. Not one of us would want to hear that explanation because it would go over all of our heads, at least I speak for myself. But we do want to know that there has been accountability. We do want to know that as a company, you are aware of the biases in your data sets, you are aware of the biases in your systems, you have turned your mind to those issues, you have documented it, you have thought through the use cases, and you have thought through the possible harms. We do want to know that. We do want to know that there has been somebody that has turned their mind to more higher risk categories of use cases that can have a legal harm to somebody or cause a legal harm or similarly situated type of harm to somebody, and that there is somebody at the center of all of this who understands the system, understands the data, was part of the governance structure, and can offer an explanation. And so here's some advice. As we think about an AI-first world, which we are not in yet, but as we think of an AI-first world, here is my lasting advice, which is, number one, as lawyers, we must be informed. We need to understand this technology. We need to understand its complexity, because the pace of change is happening so quickly that we can't just learn about it in time. We have to constantly follow how this is changing and how it impacts what we do, because that is fundamental to offering good quality service to our clients. The other is we have to get involved. So to the extent that you're in a company or you're in a hospital or you're in a law firm and there are discussions about, what are we building and should we be doing some really cool stuff with artificial intelligence? Have we really thought about our data strategy? Have we thought about our AI strategy? I urge you to be in that conversation. Get to the strategy table and help define the strategy. Because if it comes to you, if the plans come to you when they're already fully baked, it's too late. You need to inform. This is the sort of creation of artificial intelligence systems and all the accoutrements that go with it fundamentally is legal. And then finally, I say, have no fear. And I say that very broadly. These are exciting times. There's a lot of good that's out there. And as lawyers, at least from my perspective, this is some of the most exciting work we can be doing and we could be working on. So have no fear, get in the game, and enjoy the process. Thank you.